Last month, big-time YouTuber The Critical Drinker, famous for his acerbic takedowns of popular media, released a movie. It's called Rogue Elements, and it isn't great.
About 2 hours ago, we received this. It's an hard watch.
There's more here than one mid-film, though. I contend that by considering the film together with the guy's work here on YouTube, the basic flaws that lie at the heart of the drinker's critical/creative mindset, indeed, the flaws that underpin this whole wave of conservative cultural commentators, reveal themselves to the attentive viewer. How's that for a snappy intro? I promise we'll get into all that, but first, since I run a bit of a smaller operation over here, I don't have God knows who paying me to fly out and guest on the web shows of Russian assets, for instance, I'm gonna have to tell you a little bit about this video's sponsor before we get into the rest of it. Today's sponsor is Private Internet Access VPN. Surfing the web isn't always secure. Sending and downloading data is kinda like passing notes in a classroom. Other people can see your notes, can copy them even. That's why all the people in the movies fold them up, right? But you can't fold up a data packet. Or can you? Private Internet Access VPN kind of does what it says on the tin. It hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection, helping safeguard your data against crooks, and lets you reroute through servers in over 91 countries, including the option of every individual US state. And that means you can get access to region-locked sports or streaming content without moving a meter. Or a yard if you're nasty. Kinda like the spies in the movie we're discussing. See, I tied it in. PIA have been in the VPN game for over a decade, with over 30 million downloads and tons of great reviews on Trustpilot, so theirs is a name you can count on. If you use my link, piavpn.com/pillarofgarbage, you get an 83% discount, working out to just over $2 a month, plus 4 months completely free. It's also risk-free, with a 30-day money-back guarantee, and one membership covers all your devices, so you can sort out your entire household or workplace at once. And that's it. No bells, no whistles, no hidden snags, just a great deal for a great product. So thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to it. Let's start off by taking an overview. Rogue Elements is a film co-written by The Critical Drinker, real name Will Jordan, which takes place within the world of his existing thriller series. The project got funded through a Kickstarter he set up, which, owing to his fame as YouTube guy who knows all about good and bad writing, was a raging success. Well, it exceeded its 20k goal by a factor of 15 is what I mean. It wasn't necessarily a success beyond that. The project faced a lot of delays and various backers didn't receive their promised conference calls or were left out of the credits, that sort of thing. But the film did end up getting made. It was directed by Travis Grant, the other credited writer, and runs for a little over 40 minutes, including credits and both post-credit scenes. Eagle-eyed viewers will notice that the thing I'm referring to as a film is in fact labeled on YouTube as a TV proof of concept, but a film is what was pitched, what was funded, and what was seemingly developed. Maybe at some point the project was retooled, or maybe it's just a different label being slapped on the same thing to reduce viewer expectations. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if this labeling pivot was made after someone watched an assembly cut and realized that the film doesn't really work as a standalone story, titled it like this to try and offset that non-independence with the suggestion of some future contextualizing, but that's by the by. The film follows, as the intro text wall suggests, agents from a clandestine, nameless CIA division called the Shepherds, as they infiltrate a base full of Russian-backed Estonian separatists and recover a CIA asset. Our lead is a bloke named Ryan Drake, who's evidently so adept at this spycraft stuff that he's actually retrained himself to speak English in a bizarre accent mishmash.
He didn't deserve to go out like that. And we don't allow shit like this to go unanswered.
Yeah, as you might expect from an indie project, even one like this which ended up smashing its fundraising goal, these performances aren't likely to be winning any awards. There is a spectrum here. Andrea Pavlovich as Frost did a pretty good job with what she was given, I thought, but the casting of this very international script with more local actors is one area where the limits of this production become clear. And it's one of many. The score's another obvious weakness here. It's generic, it's way too present throughout the piece, overpowering many sequences, and it rarely matches the tone of what we're seeing. This isn't to say the film's uniformly dreadful from a technical production perspective, because it isn't, and I think one place that's clear is in the film's action sequences. They don't necessarily hold up to logical scrutiny, bad guys loiter in the open like bugged NPCs, lines of sight seemingly only exist when convenient, snipers set up their shots mere meters away from their targets and then don't take those shots, but sometimes the action does flow in a pleasing way, and the stunt work is generally decent too. And it should be. From the start, the Kickstarter was emphasizing the industry figures it had tapped to work on this side of the production. Professionalism was the selling point here, and it's a selling point that some scenes do deliver. The problem is everything between those scenes. The problem is what they mean, or rather don't mean, in the larger story, because there isn't really much of a story here. Dialogue is exchanged, time passes, players move from confrontation to confrontation. Objectively speaking, there is a narrative here, but it's hard to recall what happened and why it mattered after watching the film, and it's not really any easier to do so while you watch. Stakes are often muddy, interpersonal relationships often opaque, and there's nothing wrong with throwing the audience into the deep end, letting them figure out who these people are to each other, why they feel the way they do themselves. One of the best things I've read recently, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, is regarded as a sci-fi classic precisely because of how well it does this, but this approach requires you build those details into the story, and Rogue Elements doesn't really do this. In a way then, those highlight action sequences are like a pair of gleaming photographs strung up in an empty room. And we'll go on to talk more about that emptiness later, but for now let's zoom back out. So, the film. It isn't very good, and if you don't believe me, look at the film's comments. All of the Critical Drinker's own viewers are saying the same thing. But as suggested a few minutes back, I don't want that to be this video's focus. So what I'm not going to do in this video is nitpick the film any more than I have, either by my own standards or by the Critical Drinkers, despite the wealth of material Rogue Elements would offer to such a project. For instance, the most fearsome fighter in the whole thing is a skinny blonde who kinda deus ex machina saves the male protag at one point, and if you don't think there are like 300 videos of his I could very ironically cut to right now, you probably aren't very familiar with his work. Nor am I going to use Rogue Elements to point out that it's way easier to poke holes in stuff than to make stuff, that maybe writing and producing film isn't quite the straightforward process Drinker often makes it out to be, fallible only by hacks and ideologues, that not only is it harder than the Critical Drinkers ever granted to make a film that's well written, is enjoyable to all sorts of different people, sticks with them, builds in a natural and satisfying way, it's clearly also harder than he's granted to make a passably written film, one where character motivations actually come across, one where it's clear who knows what and how. So yeah, while I could do all of the above, put it together into a video, call it The Critical Drinker Made a Terrible Stinker, and get an easy 100,000 views or so in the process, I think criticism on this platform ought to have a little more thought put into it than that. So let's talk about Fredric Jameson.
Each chapter recapitulates a smart consumption process in its own right, ending with the frozen image of a new and catastrophic reversal of the situation, organizing its sentences into paragraphs, each of which is a subplot in its own right. The whole tempo of such reading, meanwhile, overprogrammed by its intermittent illustrations which, either before or after the fact, reconfirm our readerly business, which is to transform the transparent flow of language as much as possible into material images and objects we can consume.
That's Fredric Jameson on the detective thriller style of novel that shot to popularity during the 20th century. For anyone who didn't do an English degree, Jameson was a prolific literary critic and cultural theorist, probably most famous for his seminal work Postmodernism, the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, but who also contributed a lifetime of compelling cultural analysis beside that. For anyone who did, hey guys, not many jobs around, eh? The above was an excerpt from his essay Reification and Utopia in Mass Culture, originally written in 1979, which Jameson would go on to repurpose as the first chapter of his 1992 book, Signatures of the Visible, a major element of which is the writer's exploration of what he called the commodification of narrative. Jameson starts by outlining the understanding of art in traditional aesthetic philosophy, specifically in Kant, as finality without an end. That is, an activity with a goal, but without a purpose, and then contrasts this with the state of art today, or, then. Jameson writes that the objects of the commodity world of capitalism shed their independent being and intrinsic qualities, and claims the result of this was an instrumentalized culture, one which no longer necessarily considered works of art to be without purposes. When something is commodified, he continues, that something no longer has any qualitative value in itself, but only insofar as it can be used. The various forms of activity lose their immanent intrinsic satisfactions as activity and become means to an end. Jameson sees this shift as summed up best in those mass-market contemporary books, or movies for that matter, which are designed to be read for the end, the reveal, the answer, the point of the story, and for which the rest of the work, all the parts leading up to that end, is degraded to the status of sheer means. The quote I hit you with a minute ago was Jameson's description of the ways this instrumentalized mindset leaches through into the practice of the contemporary thriller-type writer, the way providing the text with a point, keeping the reader on track to reach it, becomes the target, and the way the need for this forward momentum ends up dictating the structure of chapters, of scenes, of paragraphs even. A literary optimizing reminiscent of Mr. Beast-style retention editing, or of the way a film like Rogue Elements is put together. That centrality of spectacle, the way even the film's moments of exposition feel compelled to try and keep the audience on the edges of their seats. I'll give you an example. There's a moment around a third of the way through the piece where Drake, Frost, and their other Shepard teammate Dietrich meet to establish the situation. Guy 1 has been captured, so Guy 2 needs rescuing. And it'd make sense for this to be somewhat tense. It's perfectly reasonable for these guys to be shocked and stressed by these developments, but we shoot well past somewhat. We start with confusing insults.
I was in the middle of something.
Don't worry. Whoever your latest victim is, I'm sure will be tied up in your dungeon.
But then bickering turns to confrontation, the music's back getting you pumped, and Dietrich even pulls a knife on his colleague at one point. Maybe they have a fraught history. Maybe Dietrich just woke up on the wrong side of his bed this morning. We don't know, and we're not told. The point of this scene is less to set up plot or character details for later, as it is to provide another miniature thriller nugget, one more unit of suspense to be consumed. Scenes like this make up the minute-to-minute reality of Rogue Elements, broken up by a rote reorganization of genre staple beats. The bloodthirsty torturer's speech, the hacker getting into the mainframe to provide ops, the surprise sniper save. A series of little excitement pops with nothing to say beside that excitement. And I can give you an example of what I mean by nothing to say too. I mentioned near the start of this video that Rogue Elements is ostensibly about rescuing an asset captured by Russian-backed Estonian separatists. And you'd think, especially at our present historical moment, that this story choice could prove an effective one rich with thematic potential. Rogue Elements Kickstarter was launched only months after Estonia triggered NATO's Article 4 in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It releases into a world where places like this are increasingly on everyone's map, as discussions about NATO's expansion, about Russian revanchism abound. Discussions which all too often ignore the perspectives of these countries' citizens. That is the backdrop for Drake's struggle with Volkov, this sense of peace's fragility, of the escalation risk posed by covert operations, and the film itself even recognizes that the particulars of this setting should be of interest.
They're powerful enough to destabilize the entire region.
And push them towards Russia instead.
Now, take a look at this establishing shot. We see the skyline of Tallinn, Estonia's capital, and are informed we're near the Russian border. The Estonians among you probably see where I'm going already, but for everyone else, Tallinn is here. Russia is there. Something strange is going on with this establishing shot then. Either the visuals are wrong, are of a wholly different city, are only meant to place us somewhere in Estonia, the equivalent of rolling some B-roll of the Empire State Building before cutting to an interior in Houston, or the text only means close to the Russian border on a global scale. A later line of dialogue tells us the warehouse asset Ivan's being held in exists on the outskirts of Narva, and Narva is an Estonian city which is close to the Russian border. Either the wrong B-roll was used then, and the car park showdown we open with is supposed to be in Narva too, or after capturing Ivan, the separatists then drive him across the country to stash him outside another city. Which is it then? What is the answer? Well, probably the Narva thing, but the real answer is, obviously, that it doesn't matter. The real answer is, why the fuck are you talking about the geography of Estonia? Didn't you see the spies and the guns? No part of this movie is interested in Baltic nationality, the experience of a people at the intersection of these transnational or imperialist projects. None of that is the point. Estonia is a nowhere country here. In Rogue Elements, the world is flattened down into a playground for Anglo-American violence games where setting doesn't matter, provides no resonance, grounds no themes. I said that Estonia serves as the film's backdrop, and it does, but only in the most literal sense. It's a two-dimensional, paper-thin thing, hanging out of focus behind our players as a colorless plot shuffles toward its inevitable joyless climax, and toward whichever stray drops of audience satisfaction can be mechanically drawn forth along the way. One cope that you'll see in the comments is the idea that maybe it's like this because the drinker didn't have enough creative control over his own project. These viewers simply cannot conceive of a world in which Critical Drinker could have turned out such a nothing story, despite, again, him having led the Kickstarter, having been credited as a co-writer, and even, according to a behind-the-scenes featurette mistakenly left public, having been on set giving notes.
You know, Will went in there and he had his notes about how a scene would play out or whatever. And
a script is never 100% finished, and particularly when it comes to the day of shooting, you might see things that aren't quite working, you want to tweak them a little bit, and I was able to come in and make some suggestions on how we can maybe fix a couple of things or make certain scenes flow better.
But all this starts to make more sense when you consider the Ryan Drake novels themselves, the basis of this film and of the Drinker's critical soapbox alike. James Tullos on YouTube has a good rundown of the first book you can watch if you don't fancy tracking down a copy yourself, but TLDR, in a Ryan Drake novel, the story charts a familiar feeling path through a slightly scrambled genre backdrop, all animated with a journeyman's dedication to the expected. To be sure, in the Drinker's prose, it is a little clearer who's who and what's what, but these two are generic thriller struggles between thriller agents and your thriller double-crossers, and they too are shot through with the hyper-commodified suspense at all-time writing style Jameson identified. Cliffhanger after cliffhanger, set piece after set piece, characterization as affectation. It's post-Clancy, post-Grisham airport fiction copyism. Not dreadfully done by any means, but shooting for enjoyable, for functional, over bold or new. And this obviously comes through in his YouTube channel too. This is the schema his pitches and fixes and nitpicks tend toward. Good writing must have a point, must be directed toward an end. There's a slippage here then, between good writing and a well-commodified narrative, just as there is between good writing and conventional writing of a given type. And I think those are key to this whole inquiry. One of the many things Jameson attempted in Signatures of the Visible more widely was a treatment of the sometimes misleading mass culture-high culture divide. Reading that text today with rogue elements in mind, it's interesting to note the pop cultural examples Jameson uses. The same essay we've discussed above references Jaws and The Godfather, the type of texts which exist for Jameson as touchstones of an ephemeral, commodified moment, is the same category of culture which, for figures like the Critical Drinker, stands in for an ideal past of lost quality, uninterfered with, pure. One thing revisiting criticism from the time makes perfectly clear is that this purity only ever existed in retrospect. Economic, cultural, and material considerations were impinging on those things produced by the culture industry well before Luke Skywalker ever threw away his saber. And well before Jack Reacher ever picked up a gun, for that matter, too. Let's turn back to the film. A few YouTube channels, mostly smaller ones, obviously none of the Drinker's usual objective opinion compatriots, have reviewed Rogue Elements. I've talked a lot about leopards eating faces before on this channel, and there is an amusing level of that here. Drinker fans judging the movie with his own very uncharitable superficial toolkit, but generally, verdicts lean mixed to negative, and especially among those who didn't start off as Drinker fans, a common refrain is starting to emerge. The film being as mid as it is, the Drinker's failure to walk the walk makes the media he slates on YouTube look far better by comparison, shows that it doesn't all suck, actually. And there may well be some truth to that, but I think it's a bit of an analytical dead end, or maybe a cul-de-sac, because sometimes the big films and shows aren't great either. The thing to do isn't just Uno reverse card the Drinker, because today's popular films, today's popular novels, and so on, are very often led by concerns of profitability, are commodified in all sorts of ways. But that's sort of it, right? The dynamic Jameson wrote of, by which narrative is at once thrust forward to become the point of any work and standardized, filed down, reorganized into a book or movie-long sequence of miniature build-ups and payoffs, degraded, as he puts it, Well, it hasn't necessarily been superseded in the decades since Reification and Utopia was written, but even then, it was only the most obvious of the ways storytelling had been commodified, and now, maybe more so than ever, the culture industry knows that there's more than one way to skin a cat. Or I guess that there's more than one way to pet the dog. Some of these Jameson tentatively identified in that essay, including the way that certain works of fiction produce a quasi-material feeling tone, an idea immediately vindicated by any modern reader's awareness of the Christmas movie industrial complex, for instance, and one which I think overlaps rather a lot with the current franchise IP Glut, that overlap being most apparent in that Glut's dregs. Jameson writes that this feeling tone floats about the narrative, but is only intermittently realized by it, which perfectly captures the spacious superhero-ness, Spider-Man-ness of Sony's Morbiverse. Rest in piss, by the way. Other zones of commodification beyond those Jameson laid out perhaps include fandom, and in some cases, identity. Dedicated watchers of me might be reminded of the already captured value exploitation we discussed in the slop economics video here, and doubtless there is some overlap. Regardless, I think there is a perhaps ironic way in which this flowering variety of methods for commodifying fiction, beyond ruthless optimization of narrative itself, outside of the text's mechanics, can contribute to a freeing up of the text. If a work's end is constituted in part by its tone or its franchise or the fandom of its stars, or its intersection with questions of identity, even a hyper-commercialized piece can deviate from narratological orthodoxy, often with cool results. The first Black Panther film springs to mind. T'Challa spends a great deal of the runtime as either a reactive figure responding to rather than making choices, or on the ice, both of which are kind of protagonist no-nos, but this tending away from screenwriting 101 is part of what allows the film's particular resonances regarding community and African American community specifically to emerge. And if you don't know what I'm talking about there, you probably haven't watched this FD Signifier video. Following this line of thought much further would take us into a whole other video though, so let's refocus. The Critical Drinkers YouTube channel tells us that a lot of today's mass media culture is bad, is made poorly. I'm even willing to grant that sometimes he really thinks this isn't simply following popular consensus in order to skim AdSense revenue off the top of the culture war. And he is right to notice that in some cases, the way a film's plot beats unfurl today, or the way its characterization is given, the way a trope is deployed or subverted, doesn't line up with those very streamlined models he's spent so long emulating, or with parallel models across genre and form. But he's wrong in placing those models on some privileged altar above history, outside of culture and outside the market. What's positioned in a Critical Drinker video or livestream appearance as insight into timeless, objective writing skill, the way to tell a story, the lines you do or don't cross, what's gratuitous, what fits in and what doesn't, is simply a comparison between one sort of commodified late capitalist narrative style and a whole bunch of others, a comparison blind to its own cultural contingency. That is the foundation beneath his YouTube channel and thriller series alike, the root of those slippages at the heart of the Critical Drinkers' output and thought, and of a lot of other folks besides. Because what is that impulse, that reifying placement of a subjectively selected and defined cultural good above history, outside of any ideological or economic spheres, if not the seed of conservatism itself? And in case it's not clear what I'm yapping about, real quick, let's talk about Edmund Burke. Burke is regarded as perhaps the founding figure of modern conservatism, a key influence to everyone in the orbit of today's traditionalist right, from Christopher Hitchens to the Critical Drinkers' own YouTube buddies, and a lot of that comes down to one specific tract, Reflections on the Revolution in France. This text, written essentially to condemn the French Revolution, sees Burke employ some very shoddy historicism to represent all the parts he finds good about the 18th century British system as principles inherent to a generally stable lineage stretching back to time immemorial, and he uses this representation to subsequently lambast the radicals over the channel for rocking the boat too much. Reflections argues their manner of abrupt change is always going to be worse than making incremental adjustments within the existing structures of divinely ordained monarchical power. But if you're thinking that it's awfully convenient that Burke's model for society's ideal path forward was pretty much a continuing of the type of society he'd been born into and that had allowed him to lead a very successful, very comfortable life, that, hey, sorry everyone below me on the ladders of gender, race, and class, you might have some complaints, but trust me, this is the best way to do things, might not be the disinterested apotheosis of empiricism Burke and his defenders try to sell it as, then yeah, right? Indeed, despite the emphasis on tradition, transcendent values, divinely ordained objectivity, modern conservatism is founded via this tract on a very ironic bedrock of relativity, or rather of relativity in denial. That is, Burke's judging of the stability of the revolution in a world of monarchy against the stability of monarchy in a world of monarchy, then pretending what's being compared is the worth of both. And that ironic foundation has remained. Today's conservative critic is a figure who only notices change after a point, after the chosen start point, who fails to realize that even the old masters were flies trapped in the cultural materialist amber of history alongside the rest of us. Longtime viewers will remember that this is not the first video I've made in response to the Critical Drinker's channel. Indeed, in the year and a half or so since I last made a video about the Critical Drinker, I've often been asked to do more. And that's not really a surprise. I think a lot of people know me in part as the Critical Drinker response guy. But while he's come up tangentially a couple of times in videos I've done on the right-wing YouTube grifterverse more widely, I have only directly critiqued his work 3 times before now. And one of the reasons I've not spent more of my time creating responses or analyses or debunks or whatever is that other bigger fish than I have stepped up to the plate. Videos like the Birdman's, or particularly José's, have pretty much succeeded in stripping back the guy's facade of critical legitimacy. 2 years ago, you only really thought this guy was a partisan hack if you were paying attention, and even then you'd often have to argue that point. In the interim though, a new slew of response videos, as well as a few years worth of Critical Drinker clips breaking containment and attracting mass dunking entirely off their own bat, has made a far wider slice of this website's user base aware that these videos are routinely inaccurate and typically far more ideologically loaded than the media landscape they push back against. The other reason is, well, each video I made pursued a specific point. First, it was the discourse around She-Hulk is weird, and this one very disingenuous video seems to be a big part of why. Second, it was to point out that not only were these influential, far-reaching reviews often disingenuous, they also happened to contain outright falsehoods. And third, it was to situate his work via a Barbie video directly within a network of narratives around dangerous wokeness in media. And between my videos and the others, those bigger ones and the mountain of pushback that's been going on under the radar for far longer, what is there left to say here? The Critical Drinker simply isn't that interesting a topic. He's not that unique. Barring anything really wild happening in the future then, I expect this to be the last time I cover his output. And I've done it not because Rogue Elements allows a point to be made, but because it allows the point to be made. And I don't think that point is that Rogue Elements shows the drinker failing his own criteria, the ones underpinning his reviews, his discourse. That's a point, sure, but the point? The film is flawed in ways he'd doubtless take to task if it were made by someone else, but as we've seen, stylistically, it follows his writing philosophy. It attempts to build suspense, do good writing in the same ways. Those same good old days pre-woke models are channeled, and the film is still bad, in a way that'd barely improve if you fixed all the accents and details and dialogue even. The point is that it hitched its production horse to the supposedly correct philosophical post, and it sucks regardless. Maybe then there is more to telling good stories well than the mechanical thriller-style screenwriting 101 directives, than cool yoked dudes and hot blondes bouncing from inciting incidents to stunt sequences to resolutions. And maybe that should lead the people watching Rogue Elements, maybe even those creating it, to pursue a more holistic, materialist, historical understanding of how art has developed throughout modernity, how prescriptivist our approaches to contemporary art should be, and to consider whether or not this wide, superficially appealing, conservative approach to culture has ever been worth shit. That's about it, I think. I will just say that if you do want to see a video going more into Rogue Elements particulars, one that does judge the film against the writer's own criteria, someone has done that very well, very fairly. Go check this video out from Edgier Than Thou. Thanks to all my supporters on YouTube and Patreon, especially Hanan, Daniel Goldhorn, Something Capitalism Bad, Thomas R, and Wordy Beardy. 2024 has been a pretty good year for the channel, I think, and I'm confident 2025 will be an even better one, so stay with me over the next few months. I've got some of my best essays so far in the works, and I'm really excited to share them. Bye.